Now, I don't want you to get the impression that militia organizations were the same from one colony to the next. By the time of the American Revolution, there were 13 colonies, and to varying degrees, their militia systems were all organized in different ways. So we're just going to deal with one other militia system that emerged early on. And this important example was that of Massachusetts Bay, founded in 1628. I've got the New England experience up there that tracks back to the Pilgrims or the Separatists who founded their own colony in 1620 and then eventually joined Massachusetts Bay in, I want to say, 1691. Now, so in terms of Massachusetts Bay, the Massachusetts Bay Colony begins in 1628. By 1640, numbered almost 9,000 people. By 1644, when the sort of so-called Great Migration ended, you're looking at upward of 10,000 people. We're talking men, women, and children. That's substantially a larger settlement than Virginia, and it was based upon the religious ideal of Puritanism, which was named for the desire to purify the Church of England, the official church of England, of all vestiges of Catholicism. Now, the Puritan leadership and early population placed great emphasis on religious conformity, and they had what later historians would term a covenanted militia. And under this covenanted militia, militiamen, bona fide Puritans who followed Puritan ideals closely, these militiamen were permitted to nominate their own officers. And since the Massachusetts Bay legislature, formerly called the General Court, rarely vetoed their choices, this de facto election system prevailed. And the qualification for officership under this covenanted militia was not military ability, but rather fidelity to Puritan ideals. And Captain John Underhill, who was a professional soldier used by the Puritans in the same way that in Virginia, John Smith was a professional soldier used by the Jamestown colonists. John Underhill thought this system was absurd. What you wanted to have were men of proven military competence, not men who were faithful to Puritan ideals. That might be a nice thing, but militarily it was irrelevant. Underhill himself was not a Puritan, and consequently the Puritans began to pull away from Underhill, to emancipate themselves from Underhill and other professionals who were also part of the Puritan colony at an early date. Concerned by Underhill's morality, for example, they were concerned about that. For example, Underhill at one time frequented the home of a beautiful young woman. And on those occasions, he locked the door from the inside, which naturally excited the suspicion of the Puritans. Now, Underhill protested when he was asked about this, said that he and the woman were merely having private prayer together. Puritans were not convinced. Would you be convinced? I'm not convinced. And later, Underhill confessed to adultery. Now, this covenanted militia system worked well until the Puritan colony changed. For one thing, many children of the original Puritan settlers rejected the strict Puritan lifestyle, and thus allowing militiamen to elect their own officers became non-viable. You couldn't count on these officers adhering to the ideal of Puritanism. So at that point, the top leadership of the Massachusetts Bay Colony sought to restrict elections so as to preserve committed Puritans in officer slots. And the leadership also sought to limit militia membership to the better class, since these were politically more reliable. Now, eventually, every colony had an organized militia except Pennsylvania, which was settled primarily by Quakers early on, and Quakers were pacifists. So you don't have an organized militia. You did have another system to defend Pennsylvania, but it wasn't a militia system. Now, at this point, by this time, the turn of the 17th and 18th century, the militia seldom functioned in the classic sense of every able-bodied man armed, trained, and ready for action against an external adversary. By this time, certain classes were excluded entirely from militia service. As much as 50% of able-bodied manpower by the late 17th century. The excluded persons included slaves, servants, and unpropertied men, and Africans and African Americans, regardless of whether they were free or owned property. And in reality, the militia at this point functioned as an instrument of internal political and social control. In short, effective military organization reflected societal values devised without the spur of constant Indian conflict as had occurred in Virginia. An additional political factor was this: the presence of so many armed men tended to oblige royal governors to operate with the tacit consent of the governed, usually through local elites. But how did English settlers conduct warfare against Native Americans when they had to, and subsequently European adversaries like the French? We'll examine that question another time. So for now, I bid you a fond farewell.